What's going on, everybody? I'm Daniel, Life with DA, and we've got a brand new series we're officially starting tonight. Welcome to the Front Porch. My first guest and friend, Charles Gholson. Charles, welcome. Appreciate you guys being here. Appreciate you being here. So the idea behind the Front Porch is that we're just going to come out, hang out on my front porch, sit here, go over some gear, some hunting tactics, and Charles's favorite thing to hunt, favorite hunting style, and try to provide as much information to you, the viewer, as we can to help you guys be successful. So let's jump right into it. Charles, how long have you been bow hunting?
I started bow hunting when I was probably 13. My dad used to bow hunt way back, and then had 3 kids. So when I turned about 9, he just stopped bow hunting altogether. But then when I turned 13, he bought me a youth bow, and I was lucky enough to get permission on a really good piece of private ground. And so I would stand. Dad had the junkiest stands ever, and I would stand up on the platform. There was no seat, and he would sit above me in a seat, I kid you not, this big, that slid over a screw and step. And if I made a peep or was turning my head or anything, like it wasn't good. So that was my start to hunting, and but he taught me a lot of valuable things at a really young age, and really taught me how to be still and read the woods and some of those things. So,
Right on.
yeah.
So now that you're obviously grown, out on your own, married with some kids, of course we know both of us having kids, hunting time can get scarce sometimes. Yeah. It's not like back in the college days when we could hunt all day,
Yeah.
3 or 4 days in a row. So tell me about some of your hunting experiences, what you like best. Do you enjoy private land hunting? Do you enjoy public land hunting? I know you do some public land hunting as well as I do, so we're going to get into that in a few moments. But before we get into that, we're just going to take a few minutes and kind of get to know Charles, his background, where he's coming from, and what he brings to the table as a bow hunter.
Yeah, appreciate that. So I grew up about an hour northeast of Columbia, Missouri, in a very rural setting. I always knew from a young age I'm going to go to Mizzou and I'm going to major in fisheries and wildlife. And so I started majoring, or that's what I did. I majored in fisheries and wildlife. And when I was at Mizzou, that was when YouTube public land hunting was just starting to kind of become a thing. And I got on the Hunting Beast forum, and so I was like, well, I want to try this public land hunting thing out. And my brother was in college. I think he was one class below me, and so we started venturing out onto some public land and giving it a whirl. And man, the learning curve in the beginning was very steep, because I was used to hunting really good private land, and just the way I hunted was right on the edge of a crop field. And that's just what you did. There was just tiny little fingers, and everything was crop field. And I still am blessed to be able to go back home and hunt some land. I love public land hunting more. I love the challenge of it, but it's hard to beat hunting with family.
Sure.
So a lot of times, if I go back home to hunt private, it's with my brother or with my dad. And even if I'm chasing a big deer on public, if my dad really wants to go hunting, you only get so many chances to do that. So I try to drive
Sure.
home and spend time with my brother and my dad out hunting.
And those are great memories too. Like, it's one thing to, you kind of have the self-satisfaction when you're on public land, because you're putting in the time. Here in Missouri, for those that don't know, hanging trail cameras is illegal on public ground in Missouri. Personally, I think it's dumb. I think majority of all other public land hunters think it's dumb as well, but it is what it is. So whenever you're hunting public land here in Missouri, like, you have to put boots on the ground and do your homework and scout, really put in some time to really figure out, number one, what's in the area, and then obviously with public land hunting comes pressure from other hunters and hoping that the spot you're in is far enough back where there's not 6 or 8 or 22 other hunters getting in your spot, but that's the thing that's so great about hunting, is you can have that self-satisfaction, but also too, my favorite memories are with my dad and the group of men that we hunted with when I was growing up as a kid. And you hear people talk about all the time. It's not about killing deer; it's about the memories in it, and it really is true. Like my favorite hunting weekend is opening weekend of rifle season, and it's not because I'm hunting with a gun. It's because there's a big group of us. We're doing coffee and breakfast, and we're hanging out, and we're telling stories, and it's just like it's a great energy. It's a great area to really get your feet wet into the hunting community. Now, some of the stuff you may learn at hunting camp is good or bad, so take it with a grain of salt in some cases, but again, it's just one of those great things that there's two completely different sides to hunting, versus private land and public land, and here of late I love private land hunting. I'm very fortunate, like Charles. I've got some great land that I have access to, that's private land where there's big deer, in some very well-known places around the state of Missouri, and so it's a blessing to be able to hunt the rut where I get to hunt. But I'm also thankful too that Charles and I living here in mid-Missouri. Here I live right here in Fulton, Missouri, and in Callaway County alone, the county that I live in, there's over 30,000 acres of public land hunting that is accessible for bow hunting, and then there's a fraction of that is available for gun hunting public land as well, Mark Twain National Forest. So there's so many places right here in the Midwest that you can public land hunt and really get your feet wet and try it. And that's exactly what I did. Like you said, hey, I want to try this public land hunting. I grew up where my dad was a pastor and we lived in town, and so I didn't have a family farm or a place to really call my own. We had to have permission to go hunting where we did, and it was hit or miss every year depending on who got to the landowner first. So whenever I really got into hunting in college, I was public land hunting because that's what was available to me, and I hadn't quite learned to go knock on doors yet. And really try to get a lease or track down an area, and it wasn't until probably 2010, 2012 to where I really caught on to trying to get better at hunting with your gear, with your setup, where you're hunting, how you're hunting. So what's some of your favorite tactics that you like? Both, maybe we'll jump into private land first and then hop over to public land, that you really enjoy.
So it might be surprising to a lot of people, but we actually sometimes like to run draws. I think the hunting public calls it wind bumping. There's a lot of different names, but just this last year, my brother was out hunting one piece, and I was a couple miles away on a different piece, and there was a big 8-point that he was chasing. He was like, dude, can you come run this draw? Well, we didn't catch up to the 8-point, but I ended up pushing a 9-point to him. It was a pretty decent deer, and he shot it at 30 yards. And so I actually wind bumped the deer to him. I was moving real slow, and he killed it like that. My best private land deer is actually one that my brother ran a draw, and I was sitting on my knees in a little CRP patch, and he came sprinting right down the edge of this tiny little draw, and I shot him at 8 yards. And so it's kind of crazy, but we've actually had pretty decent luck running draws. Now, we try to be specific. Some of our pieces don't set up well to do that.
Sure.
But we'll actually do that a couple times a year. We have, one of the farms we have has a really big CRP piece in it with crop ground pretty much all the way around it. And so we have
probably a pretty good bedding area.
Yeah.
I would assume, or a safe haven.
So a couple years ago, there was like 20-something does bedded in there. So pre-rut was just madness. There was big deer all over the place, just diving into that CRP looking for the does. The next year they cut that CRP, and we barely saw a buck. So that was pretty interesting. But we set up, I think we have 8 stands on a couple hundred acres and in strategic locations. And we honestly don't move them that much.
Right.
And so that's kind of how we hunt that. I usually take my hang and hunt setup if I've noticed, like, okay, we've burned a stand out and the deer are like just right over here. I'll take it and I'll do a hang and hunt. My dad is not really interested in doing hang and hunt, and so sometimes we'll save certain stands for him.
Sure.
But we got enough stands where we can kind of play the wind. But it's a whole different animal, I guess, than
Sure.
when I go hunt public land.
Yeah, I would agree with you a lot of that. That's kind of a lost art, wind bumping. Probably, too, that you don't see a whole lot. Now, Missouri, depending on where you're at, if you're up in the northeast, northwest corners, obviously you're going to have giant crop fields because you're close to Iowa, where it's big, big farm country, and then obviously down south, along the Arkansas border, you're going to get into the Ozark Mountain terrain, to where there's a lot more hills and hollers. And wind bumping, group hunting, deer drives, are almost a lost art. And that, as a kid, that was always a fun thing. I always got to be on the receiving end because I was the kid. So typically my dad would be like, "Hey, we're gonna loop up and around. Go over here and sit down and get ready, and make sure if you see orange, don't shoot towards us, but if you get a chance to, something's running to you, I know my dad several years in a row, that was the best way to kill a doe, was to bump them, have somebody walk towards you, and it's a great tactic, and it's a tactic you can do on public land too, but it's just one of those things you got to take a whole lot more precautions. Maybe not so much during bow season, because hopefully you're going to be spread out enough. But I know on public land, opening day of deer season with a rifle can kind of be hectic. I would say on any public land around the U.S. So if you're doing stuff like that, obviously be safe, take precautions. Know your target, know what's behind your target. Obviously, hunting 101. But jumping into public land setups, we're really fortunate where we live that the Missouri Department of Conservation, state parks, the conservative conservation, I can't remember, but several entities within the state contract out with farmers for crop fields, and so a lot of the public land you and I hunt have corn and soybeans on them, whereas I know a lot of other public land places don't have any food sources other than, say, acorns or just regular green forage that deer are accustomed to. So it makes hunting here in the Midwest at a really good advantage because we are right on the I-70 corridor.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of know, everybody kind of knows, about 60 miles south of I-70, and then everything north in Missouri is typically where your bigger deer are found, and we're pretty much sitting in the bullseye of the bulletin board. Of Missouri, we're a bullseye. We're kind of right here in the heart of where big deer country kind of starts.
Yeah, definitely.
So go ahead and public land wise, whenever you're getting ready to go on some public land, maybe talk about what was a couple mistakes you made, and then how'd you learn from those mistakes, and what do you do differently now that it's made you successful? I know you've killed couple pretty decent bucks on public land. So
yeah, I've killed 4 good public land deer so far with my bow, and missed or messed up more than I would care to share on camera. I mess up all the time, but I started off hunting close to the truck, and my first setups were, a $40 Menards hang on and maybe a couple climbing sticks, or me and my brother would climb branches, and we never wore a harness. Not things that I would recommend people do now.
Right.
But I remember setting up on the ground, like right on the main path that all the hunters like walk up, and I did see some deer. But over time, like, I started realizing, like, man, all the pressure is, like, I'm setting up in these areas, even if there's deer sign, where all the pressure is,
right,
and not realizing all this is night sign. There might be a deer highway through here, but the deer are very rarely here, and so a lot of times I would shift further and further back. But the biggest mistake that I think that I made when I was starting out is that I would always go to the same spot or the same tree, and I would walk the same path. And so my routes to get there, I wasn't being conscious of, like, how am I getting there? And so I still have places where I will hunt the same tree maybe 4 times throughout a season. But the way in which I get to that tree is very dependent on a lot of different conditions.
Sure.
A couple years ago, I was hunting a couple nice bucks, and all of a sudden, like, I just stopped seeing them. and I have a really good late season spot. And I was going in there, and the sign was there, and I just was not seeing these deer. Well, one morning, real early, I was almost done setting up my hanging hunt setup, and a hunter came walking right down the fence. He came off of private land, and I wasn't expecting he came off private land and walked right past me. Well, it turns out I knew right where his stand was. He already had the stand hung. Well, he was walking the fence all the way down and all the way back every single day. And when I realized that, I made an adjustment and went like 75 yards beyond where his stand was. And I ended up shooting my first January buck with my bow, a pretty decent 10 point, and it was 75 yards beyond where he had walked. So all the deer had shifted over and were crossing the fence where he wasn't walking up and down the fence all the time. And so, you know, making that adjustment, realizing but that hunter wasn't seeing the deer, and he wasn't realizing he's walking right the same path all the time, right where the deer are wanting to be, and they were adjusting, and they were going right on each side of where he was entering the woods.
Right on.
And so now I try to be far more conscious of how am I going to get to this stand, or maybe I can't even. Maybe I know a tree and it's a good spot, but I'm not going to hunt it because I can't get there without pushing my wind where I think those deer are going to be bedded.
Right.
So how I get there, I know some guys love to tree hop like crazy, but I'll say 3 of the 4 bucks that I've killed are within a very small, probably within 20 acres. A very, very small area, and I'll throw quite a few hunts every season at that spot, but I've come to know that one spot really well, and the deer are in there. Now, there's probably 10 stands within this 40-acre little piece, but if you learn how the deer are using that, it helps so much. One thing that I spend a lot more time doing than I ever used to is as soon as I get done hunting in a morning, I'll start wandering around a little bit and mark where I see sign. Now, obviously, I'm not trying to do that for 4 days in a row because that's going to mess up the area. But,
sure,
you know, after a set, you know, if I'm not going to be back in there for a week, I'll go venture around. And that's how I realized that big buck was crossing about 75 yards from that guy. I found one big track. That's the only thing I saw. But there was one big track coming off of this really hairy, thick plateau. And the deer was coming right off of that in this little pinch. And he was crossing the fence onto private. There's some bean fields probably 3/4 of a mile from there. And so he was coming off that plateau, walking through the neighbors, and then hitting the bean field. But that probably 30 minutes of extra scouting, I found that one big track. And then I went back in there 2 days later when the wind was right, when the conditions were right, and killed him in January. So
very right on, very good. I know, in agreement with what you said, you know, one of the things that I've learned hunting public land. So where I live, I'm not going to give you my specific address, but I will tell you I'm in an area, like I said, in Callaway County, where there's 30,000 acres of public land hunting, and I am within a 15-minute drive on a gravel road to about 12,000 of those 30,000 acres. So I try to hunt a lot of public land because it's super accessible from where I live and where I work. And one of the things that I've learned that goes along with what Charles was saying is really paying attention to the sign and to those, to those small details. Is if you get to an area and you think, man, this is a great spot, I know I can kill a deer here, chances are a handful of other hunters thought the same thing. So even though the sign is there and it might produce a good spot, and I'm not saying you can't kill a deer in that spot, but I would venture to say that if you, like Charles, found just a few 50 to 100 yards in a different direction, there might be a spot you can set up on that's going to give you that advantage over the other guy who repeatedly goes to that spot because it looks so good. Yeah.
You know, it's funny you mentioned another guy might have found it, because I made a new friend this year who hunts a lot of the same public ground that I do, and he was telling me some stories about some deer, and I'm like, I'm pretty sure I know what deer you're talking about, and I'm pretty sure I know what area. And so we shared. I use Hunt Stand that I've just used it forever, and I really like that. He likes Onyx, but he sent me a snapshot, and I was like, I had pinned like half the same spots that he had pinned on public land. So I sent him my screenshot, and if you overlaid them we were focusing on a lot of the same deer in a lot of the same areas, and we had no idea. But he had done his homework and found the same spots. And this was 2.5 miles. No joke, 2.5 mile walk one way from the truck. There is a way you can go up the backside like 1.5 miles, but it's a crazy walk. But that just goes to show there's other hunters that are out there putting boots on the ground, putting the work in, and finding the very same spots.
I know everybody is like, oh, don't talk, don't say anything. And if you're watching this video and you ever see me at a public land spot, you see my truck, I will tell you, I'll be the first person to tell you where I've seen deer and what I'm seeing, because I want you to be just as successful as I am. Now, I may not give you all the pieces to the puzzle, but I will definitely give you a few pieces to help you get started in the right direction. Now, obviously, if you and I were hunting together, Charles, we're good friends. I'm going to take you to some of my better spots and try to get you on deer, and I know you would probably do the same. And I'm not saying you got to spill the beans to everybody, but I will say I've learned from experience. The more you're willing to talk, chances are the other person is willing to talk too.
Yeah, which
and I think it goes a long way, and I think it's just good sportsmanship. I'm not saying, hey, like I said, don't spill the beans if you put in the time and potentially the other person hasn't put in the time, and you don't want to give away your homework. I get that, and I'm in that same boat. I've been there. But from a aspect of not sitting on top of each other 10 or 15 yards apart, setting up in the dark, it's just respectful and it's just good sportsmanship. Just say, hey, here's the general area I'm at. This is what I've been seeing. This is, an area I'm probably going to sit in, and it just gives you the opportunity for both hunters or multiple hunters to be successful and to not crowd each other or take a chance of ruining each other's hunts.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you mention that, because the best spot that I have, the spot where I killed those 3 bucks, I actually found because there was an old timer who I met in the parking lot, and the spot is kind of hard to get to, especially if you don't come off private land or you don't know. There's kind of a little trick to get back there. But he told me, he said, hey, we've killed a couple good bucks this year, and where we hunt, and I knew exactly where he hunted. But he said, but man, when I was younger, where the real big bucks like to hang out is this spot over here. And that's how I first discovered that spot. And that's where I killed the 3. And I hit a branch on one. One of the deer I was hunting came down off a rise one day with only half his rack. And so I didn't shoot him. And I missed another one, like really straight down. I just shot right over his back. And looking back, I probably wouldn't shoot that shot again, having not practiced it. But so I mean, I've encountered so many mature deer in that one spot, and the only reason I found it is because he said, "Hey, try this spot back here." Yeah, and it turned out to be it's a honey hole, and so every year I always throw several sets at it. Last year it was pretty bad. The 2 years before that it was a great spot. And it just seems like most of the time there's at least one nice mature buck that likes to use it. And I mean, there's reasons why. There's really thick bedding up on these really tall hills. What happens is you can muzzleloader hunt this spot, and what happens is there's a lot of pressure that comes in during muzzleloader season.
Right.
It's really good early season, and then I rarely see nice deer through October and even early November. But when the muzzleloader hunters come in, they push the deer back to these really thick bedding areas. And so I've killed one in November, one in December, and one in January. So actually it's a really good late season spot because pressure pushes all the deer to those spots.
Right on.